Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Glam and I am currently a PhD candidate in sociology in the sociology program here at University of Buffalo. I am writing my dissertation on environmental sociology and issues of contamination which disproportionately impact members of the Buffalo community. And so this is known as environmental inequality in the environmental sociology literature. And so I will be teaching your Introduction to Sociology online course for the duration of the summer session. And I'd like to get started by just introducing sociology to you as a topic. And then we'll have a good foundation going forward into the rest of the course. So at this point, feel free to sit back, relax, grab a drink or a snack, take some notes, and just give a listen to what I'm about to say as though I were your regular professor in your classroom setting. Okay, so Introduction to Sociology is as the name of the course implies, a basic intro level 100 level course that is meant to provide you with a survey level understanding of sociology in terms of what are the types of things that sociologists focus on. What is sociology? What are sociologists? What do we study? How do we study it? And what are some trends over time in history, and how has that changed in terms of how we study social life? And so I just want to start out the course by giving a brief definition of sociology. And so sociology was first invented, coined, if you will, as a term by the classical sociologist Auguste Comte. That's Comte. And so Comte was an Enlightenment philosopher who was writing and thinking at the same time as a lot of other people in the mid to late 1800s about issues pertaining to humanity and humanism and how knowledge is produced and how social life can be understood. And so Comte is going to be the first to use this term sociology to describe the study of people, or the study of us, if you will. And so Auguste Comte is going to come along and coin this term. And we're going to have a progression of classical theorists such as Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Zimmel, Mead, and then into what we would call more contemporary theorists of the last 100 years, many of whom were actually American. So people like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who talked about women's place in society, W.E.B. Du Bois, who spoke on issues pertaining particularly to people of color, African Americans in the United States in the mid-1900s, that many of which those ideas are still very relevant today. And so there's a long and established field of sociology that dates back close to 100 years, or like 150 to 100 years, even though sociology as itself is one of the youngest disciplines, actually. And so a lot of people still don't really know exactly what sociology is. And so one thing that's useful for understanding sociology is the work of Peter Berger, who actually just passed away, unfortunately. He was 88 years old. He was a founding father of sociology. And Peter Berger advanced this notion of the sociological imagination, that in order to understand the world through a sociological lens, we need to peel back the layers of social life. We need to pull back the veil or the curtain on things and really understand them in a way that you couldn't really grasp just by looking at the outside of things. Because social life, like ogres, is like an onion, right? And so usually the meat of things is underneath the surface. And so Peter Berger talks about looking beyond or looking behind um, the obvious or the common sense explanations for social life as being the primary goal of sociology. And so he says that the sociological imagination, particularly, is the ability to look at one's own problems or to look at problems that impact individuals and to understand them as more than just individual troubles, but actually as systemic, wide scale problems that are made up of experiences that are shared by very large groups of people with one or more characteristics in common that make them similar. So, again, because this is an important term, the sociological imagination, or sometimes also called the sociological perspective and attributed to C. Wright Mills, um, refers to the ability to understand individual problems as not just inherent or unique to the individuals that they happen to, but as systemic, as structural, as widely shared by other people with similar characteristics in comparable walks of life. And so, an example of applying a sociological perspective to understanding an issue might be there are particular issues that impact certain generations of people. And so, people talk a lot about the millennial generation. The millennial generation tends to refer to people who are currently in their late 20s or early 30s. These are people who are old enough to remember 9/11, who witnessed the transition from dumb phones to smartphones and the rise of social media and mass communication on Facebook, Twitter, etc., as we know it today. And so, actually, myself, I would be considered a member of the millennial generation. And so, one particular issue that someone who is in this age bracket might experience is that they might have gone to college and might have accrued a significant amount of student loan debt as a result of attempting to fund their college education. Now, that individual, if they were to look at their experiences from an asociological or a non-sociological point of view, they might say, what is wrong with me that I have allowed myself to be in this position now where I now have all this student loan debt? Maybe I didn't even finish college, and now I have to repay it all, and I'm even having a really hard time finding a job. And so that would be a very ahistorical approach because it doesn't take into account all of the historical factors that have pushed many members of the millennial generation into college careers, things like their parents teaching them that that's the route to success, regardless of whether or not it was, because that was the norm, right? And that's also an inherently asociological approach because it looks at an individual trouble, but it doesn't understand it as part of a much wider and broader shared context of a social problem. So a social problem is something that is a problem that's shared by a wide range of people. And so actually, student loan debt is a very huge social problem impacting millennials and members of other generations today. Student loan debt has surpassed credit card debt as the major form of debt that people have. And so, as a result of that, you see many members of the millennial generation uh, saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, which has accrued interest over the years, that they're now struggling to try to repay. There are thousands, if not millions, of people in this boat um, because so many people have been socialized to go to college when they couldn't afford it because it was so expensive. So they took out loans. Maybe they didn't get counseling on how to appropriately spend the loans, and maybe they took out too many or something. And it takes a really long time to pay those loans back. And so there are a lot of people in this situation. To take a sociological perspective on student loan debt among millennials is to understand that it's a widely shared social problem and not just something that impacts individuals because they're fiscally irresponsible or otherwise individually flawed. I mean, some people might also be fiscally irresponsible, but that's not the purview of sociology. Sociology looks at largely what do you have in common with other people. That's the sociological perspective. What are the connective threads that create a common experience for us in our society? And as it turns out, there are many of them. And so that's the sociological perspective in a nutshell. And so when you are understanding material for this course, it is essential for you to take a sociological perspective on the different topics that we discuss and that we cover. Because a big risk or threat in understanding things from a social perspective is something that we tend to call victim blaming in social sciences, which is that if we don't understand the broader social contexts that shape people's decision making, even when they make decisions we may or may not agree with, or that may or may not benefit them in the end, that context, when that becomes lost to us, we may resort to this tendency to blame individuals for the things that they do or the problems that they have or the mistakes that they make without taking into account that there is a much broader context that is impacting them and restricting their ability to exercise what we call agency, which is your ability to act on your own behalf and make choices in your own best interest. And so, for example, there's a lot of victim blaming that occurs with people who are poor or people who do not have a lot financially. A lot of people may look down on them for the financial choices that they make without having a lot of compassion or empathy for their circumstances. However, sociology allows us an objective and empirical research standpoint to say, look, maybe we shouldn't have, for example, stereotypes about people who are on public assistance or welfare programs applying to people systematically across the board in ways that are used to actually scale back those benefits for everybody. Because there's a lot of stereotypes about people who are on welfare, people who are on public assistance, that maybe they try to game the system and get rich off the system, or there's always the stereotype of the welfare queen who has a lot of children to try to get more money to get that Cadillac or whatever, But then in reality, what we see is a lot of people, especially poor mothers, struggling to get by without help under very restricted um, public policy guidelines that don't allow them often to get the assistance they need because of those stereotypes and the way that they have been allowed to be enacted into law through largely conservative agendas over time. And so the reason why, for example, women who receive welfare benefits today, it is inaccurate to say that they have a lot of children in order to receive more benefits, is because that has been false since the early 90s, when then President Bill Clinton signed into legislation the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, or Workfare, that said in order to be eligible for welfare benefits, you must be actively seeking employment. You must take the first job that you are offered, regardless of whether it makes sense financially to you. And the other part of that legislation was that it disallowed people to continuously receive welfare benefits based on additional children that they have. And so a lot of the stereotypes that people have about different groups that are actually used to oppress those groups are based on incorrect visions of what life is like for those groups, a lack of empathy, certainly, but also a very sociological understanding of the social contexts in which we all live our lives and the choices we make. And so the other aspect of this is that anyone who has ever actually struggled to get by financially knows, right, that there is a difficult calculus to be made to balance out how to get your welfare entitlements and your benefits, and how to actually survive. And so, should I work one job? Should I work two jobs? What if I quit my one job? I'll get more welfare benefits. I'll actually make more money than if I'm working two jobs. It makes more sense, because then I won't be breaking my butt off for 60, 70 hours a week. And so there is a delicate calculus to be made. People have to do this math in order to survive and have enough to get by. But then when people look in on the outside, they judge it and they act like people are like trying to game the system or something. So there are a lot of factors that come into play when thinking about sociology, thinking about sociology, thinking about the sociological perspective, thinking about agency and constraints, thinking about social structure, thinking about the difference between individual problems and structural problems that affect a lot of people, and understanding that there is a much broader context that is often used to oppress groups that already have very little amounts of power. And it's important to try to critically investigate our own beliefs so that we don't become complicit in those stereotypes and in those systems of power. And so that concludes lesson 1 on the sociological perspective and introduction to sociology. And I will pick back up with you for lesson 2. Thank you.